The morning fog clung to the hills of Portland as Margaret Chen stepped off the bus at the corner of Ashworth Avenue. She clutched her worn leather bag closer, feeling the weight of her 2 children's school lunches inside. At 63, Margaret had learned to carry burdens without complaint, a skill honed through decades of quiet perseverance. The Hartwell estate loomed before her, all glass and steel modernity, a stark contrast to the century-old oaks that surrounded it. Margaret had worked here for 8 months, maintaining the sprawling property for tech entrepreneur Julian Hartwell, a man whose fortune came from revolutionizing renewable energy storage. Their interactions were brief, a nod here, a terse instruction there. He was always absorbed in his phone, his mind perpetually elsewhere. Margaret didn't mind. She preferred the solitude of her work, tending the elaborate Japanese garden, polishing the museum-quality floors, and preparing simple meals that Mr. Hartwell rarely ate. The job paid well enough to support her daughter Lily, a nursing student, and her son Marcus, who was finishing high school while working nights at a grocery store. What Mr. Hartwell didn't know, what nobody at the estate knew, was that Margaret left each evening not for a comfortable home, but for a homeless shelter downtown. 3 years ago, after her husband's death and a series of medical bills, she'd lost their small apartment. Pride had kept her silent. She'd secured a P.O. box for her address, wore the same 2 sets of carefully maintained clothes on rotation, and never spoke of the nights spent on a cot, protecting her children as they slept in adjacent beds. Julian Hartwell prided himself on his efficiency. He'd built a billion-dollar company by eliminating waste, optimizing systems, and keeping emotions separate from decisions. His home ran like his business, smooth, predictable, impersonal, but lately, something nagged at him. A board member had recently criticized his disconnection from ordinary people, suggesting it made him a poor leader. The comment stung more than Julian cared to admit. He'd grown up poor himself, in a Detroit neighborhood where survival meant toughness, not sentimentality. He'd clawed his way up, and he'd be damned if he'd apologize for his success. Still, the words lingered. One Thursday evening, Julian left work early, a rarity. As he drove up his winding driveway, he noticed Margaret walking down the hill toward the main road, her bag over her shoulder, her pace deliberate despite an obvious limp he'd never noticed before. On impulse, he slowed his Tesla and watched her in his rearview mirror. She didn't turn toward the residential streets, where he'd assumed she lived. Instead, she headed toward the bus stop on the commercial strip. Julian sat at the intersection, fingers drumming the steering wheel. He should go home. This was none of his business. Margaret's personal life was her own. He turned left and followed the bus route. The bus wound through Portland's evening traffic, stopping at the Arts District, then the industrial zone, before finally pulling up near the Burnside Bridge. Julian kept several cars behind, feeling simultaneously foolish and compelled. When Margaret disembarked, he parked in a coffee shop lot and watched from a distance. She walked 3 blocks to a large brick building with a faded sign, St. Vincent's Community Shelter. Julian's chest tightened. He watched Margaret enter through the side door, greeting a security guard with a warm smile that transformed her usually reserved face. Moments later, 2 teenagers emerged from a different entrance, a young woman with Margaret's high cheekbones and a tall young man with a protective posture. Her children, they walked together to a food cart on the corner, pooling coins to buy dinner. Julian saw Margaret break her meal in half to give larger portions to her kids. He saw her laugh at something her daughter said. He saw her son drape his jacket over her shoulders when the evening wind picked up. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, unable to move, unable to process what he was witnessing. The woman who maintained his home, who ensured his life ran smoothly, was homeless. Julian didn't sleep that night. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by images of Margaret counting coins for a burrito. The juxtaposition was obscene, his home, with its 8 bedrooms and temperature-controlled wine cellar, versus her nights on a shelter cot. Why hadn't she said anything? Why hadn't he asked? By dawn, he'd made a decision. But not the obvious one. Julian had built his empire on strategic thinking, and charity, though well-intentioned, often created dependency. He'd seen it in the non-profits he funded. Give people money, and you might solve their immediate problem, but you don't give them dignity. He wanted to do something different for Margaret. Something that empowered rather than pitted. Over the next week, Julian became a spy in his own home. He observed Margaret's work with new eyes. She wasn't just cleaning, she was restoring. A scratch on an antique table would be carefully buffed out. Dead plants were replaced before he noticed them dying. She'd even reorganized his chaotic home office one day when he was traveling, creating a filing system that actually made sense. She had skills. Real skills that went far beyond housekeeping. Julian began leaving the house earlier, taking different routes, asking casual questions. Margaret, I noticed the garden looks exceptional. Have you worked with landscaping professionally? Her humble deflections told him everything. Yes, she had skills, but circumstance had driven her to take whatever work was available. The plan crystallized. 2 weeks after following Margaret to the shelter, Julian called her into his study. She appeared promptly, hands clasped, expression neutral. Margaret, please sit down. She perched on the edge of the leather chair, clearly uncomfortable. I've been reviewing my property management, Julian began, choosing his words carefully. The estate is growing. I'm acquiring the adjacent lot to expand the gardens and add a guest house. I need someone to oversee the entire property management operation. Not just maintenance, but design, vendor relationships, staff hiring. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in the position. Margaret blinked. I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Hartwell. I'm offering you a job as my estate manager. It would mean a significant increase in responsibilities, but also in compensation. The salary would be $95,000 annually, plus full benefits. The guest house, once completed in 60 days, would be yours to live in, rent-free, as part of the compensation package. In the meantime, I have a furnished apartment in the Pearl District, corporate housing I'm not using. You'd be doing me a favor by occupying it so it doesn't sit empty. Margaret's face went white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I've watched your work, Margaret. You have an eye for detail and a level of care that can't be taught. These are skills I need. But I understand if you need time to consider, yes. The word burst from her like a prayer. Yes, Mr. Hartwell. I accept. Her eyes filled with tears she tried desperately to hide. Julian pretended not to notice, shuffling papers on his desk. Excellent. I'll have my attorney draw up the contract. You can move into the Pearl apartment this weekend. I'll have a car service transport your belongings. We don't have much, Margaret whispered. Then it will be a quick move. Julian finally looked up, allowing himself a small smile. Welcome to your new position, Margaret. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was profound. Within a month, Margaret had hired a small team, implemented sustainable landscaping practices that reduced water usage by 40%, and designed an expansion to the Japanese garden that left Julian speechless. She'd found her daughter Lily a paid internship at a nearby hospital through connections with one of the contractors. Her son Marcus, with stable housing and meals, had raised his grades enough to earn a scholarship opportunity, but the real change was in Margaret herself. The weariness that had dulled her eyes faded. She smiled more freely. She made suggestions in their weekly meetings with a confidence that came from security, from knowing that tonight she and her children would sleep safely under their own roof. Julian found himself looking forward to their meetings, asking her opinions on matters beyond property management. She had insights about community development, about the disconnect between wealth and impact, that challenged him in ways his board members never could. One evening, 6 months after the promotion, Julian found Margaret in the garden at sunset, sketching plans for a meditation pavilion. Margaret, may I ask you something? She looked up, tucking a strand of grey hair behind her ear. Of course. Why didn't you tell me about your situation before? Margaret set down her pencil, considering the question. Pride, I suppose. And fear. I thought if you knew, you'd see me differently. As a problem to be solved, or a liability. I needed to be just the housekeeper, someone competent and invisible. I was so busy seeing through you, I never actually saw you, Julian said quietly. You see me now. Margaret's smile was gentle. That's what matters. Julian nodded, looking out over the garden she'd helped create. I learned something these past months. Real wealth isn't what you accumulate. It's what you do with it. And real poverty isn't a lack of money, it's a lack of seeing each other's humanity. Your board member was right, you know, Margaret said. You were disconnected. But you had the courage to change. That's rarer than you think. The Hartwell Estates Community Garden Program was featured in Architectural Digest, praised for its innovative model of providing job training and fresh produce to homeless families. Margaret Chen, now Director of Community Development for Hartwell Enterprises, oversaw 3 similar projects across the Pacific Northwest. Lily had graduated nursing school and was working in a free clinic Margaret had helped Julian fund. Marcus was in his sophomore year at Portland State, studying urban planning. Julian still checked his phone too often and struggled with work-life balance, but he'd learned to pause. To see the people around him. To understand that efficiency without empathy was just another form of poverty. The garden pavilion Margaret had designed became a meditation space where Julian started each morning, watching the sunrise through the Japanese maples. Some mornings, Margaret joined him with 2 cups of tea, and they'd sit in companionable silence, 2 people who'd learned that the distance between invisibility and recognition was simply the choice to look.